Having the right brushes and using proper brush technique can make all the difference when painting pet portraits. Hi, my name is Lauren Elizabeth with Lauren Elizabeth Animal Art, and I help take beginner and intermediate level artists to become masters of acrylic animal art while reducing stress and having lots of fun. And we have a very fun tutorial for you today, but while I walk you through this very beginner level, step-by-step Basset Hound tutorial of sweet little Floyd, I'm going to talk all about brushes. I'll cover my 8 most favorite brushes that I absolutely cannot go without when I'm painting pets. I'll cover proper brush technique, and you'll see that these brushes have multiple different functions. They're very versatile. And then I'll cover brush maintenance so that your brushes can last as long as mine have for me. And I've also included a traceable outline of Floyd, which can be transferred very easily to any canvas or paper using charcoal transfer paper. I have that traceable link down below. And yes, this is a beginner level tutorial. I have even slowed down the footage. I simplify this process as much as possible. I walk you through every single step in real time, actually in slower than real time. So you guys don't have to worry. If you're a beginner or you're just getting back into it, this tutorial you can do. All right, guys, so without further ado, let's get started. Now, what I teach in this video, I've put into an in-depth brush guide with the list of my 8 most favorite brushes that I use for painting pets, a free download that is linked in the description, along with the paint colors needed for this tutorial. I use the Fluid Titanium White by Golden Brand, the only white I buy. All the rest of my paints are either by Master's Touch that I get from Hobby Lobby or by Liquid-X. There's this variation in viscosity that really helps me get that vibrant, rich color and get this perfect, creamy consistency that helps me cover the canvas efficiently. All right, so I'm going to pull up my palette knife. We're going to mix up our background colors. I'm going to mix 1 pile of just phthalo blue and lots of white. Again, that's phthalo cyanin blue and white. And I say it's better to have more than not enough, so make sure you mix up enough. Now for our next color, it's going to be a blue-violet mixture. Right next to this one, I'm going to pull in some of this blue and lots more white and a bit of violet, just a tiny bit of violet. I want to make these both medium to light and value, not too dark, also not too light. That's because when I'm painting Basset Hounds, I like to use the colors yellow and orange, both the complements of these 2 colors. All right, so make sure you have your cloth or paper towel and a cup of water using my size 10 angle brush by Arteza. I'm going to make sure my brush is clean and damp, never sopping wet and dripping, but moist so that when I go to pick up the paint with the thin amount of paint on my brush, it glides over my canvas. So I'm going to start with our blue-violet in the upper left-hand corner. Now I say it's better to go over your outline than having to go back to this color and fill in any gaps. Of course, it makes sense to maintain proportions right now, but if you go into that sketch, it's all right. We can paint right over it, and that's actually what we're gonna do. Lots and lots of layers. Now, the difference between this brush and a flat brush is that point. Not only can we efficiently cover large areas like a large flat brush, but we can also get into tiny ones too, creating all sorts of texture or a nice blended smooth layer. So I like to position that point up as opposed to facing down, using that flat edge, and then if I have to, move it around the angles and getting into any nooks and crannies with that point. All right, so before we start working around that nose, that's when I'm going to start blending in that blue. And by the way, I did slow down this footage, but at any point if you need to go back or I'm going too fast, just use the pause and play button on your screen. Now, the creative process is very much a mind and body experience. We need to prepare both to do our best in a painting. So what we're going to do now is 5 deep breaths in through the nose and then a long expression through the mouth. Ready? Do that 5 times. This is the fastest way to calm down that central nervous system, helping us to focus, helping our minds to be more clear, and making good decisions as we paint. All right, creatives, so here I go picking up the blue and right on my canvas into that blue violet. I'm going to blend that in. Now this only will work if that blue violet is still damp. Once it's dry or once it gets a little sticky or tacky, it's impossible to blend. So if you need to pick up more of that blue violet, blend it up, not down, because I'm trying to get all that paint off my brush, that mixture of the violet and the blue, so that as I move down, it's just blue. What I love so much about blue and violet, especially these colors, is their dominance. They're pretty equal in dominance, so that means if I'm using a darker color, that tends to overpower a lighter color like yellow or orange or pink, and you end up using a lot more of that lighter color so that it blends into that darker color, but not here. This is why these two colors are almost always on my paint palette. Now the sides of your canvas are still a part of the painting, so before we move on to the pup, let's finish off those sides. Also, let me know what you think about this tutorial's music. Is it putting you to sleep? Is it relaxing? Is it annoying? Is it too loud? Is it too soft? I want to know what you think so I can make the next tutorials better. Now I'm going to set my angle brush aside and grab my size 1 liner brush by Arteza. This is going to help me paint in between that lip and that large tooth. Now between the size 1 liner brush and my size 1 round brush by Arteza, these are 2 brushes I just can't put down. They're not too thin, say like a rigger brush where the paint just dries so fast to them and I can't mix colors because their bristles are so too few and too thin. And it's also not too thick where it doesn't allow me to get into those tiny little spots and gaps, making the size 1 liner brush and the size 1 round brush ideal for painting fur, filling in tiny noses, eyes, teeth. And if you take care of these brushes, being that they're so thin and delicate and long, if you just use Dawn soap to wash them out, I'm using the ones I bought from Arteza since 2021. Can you believe it? To paint all my custom pet portraits and all my tutorials. So as you can see here, I've gone back to my damp size 10 angle brush. I'm just doing a little bit more blending here, adding more paint so that I can smooth it out. So just take this time to complete your background. Then we'll wash out our brushes, let our canvas dry for about 5 minutes, and then we'll start working on Floyd. Now, are you looking to improve your cat and or dog acrylic portraits? Has it been a while? Are your skills a little rusty? Or maybe you're just starting out with acrylic paint. While animal art therapy played an enormous role in my addiction recovery, it was actually when I hit rock bottom years ago, I added in this new habit to create animal art, drawing and painting animals every morning and night while feeding my mind with good, wholesome things, worship music, listening to painting tutorials, combined with regular group therapy, and all this led to my successful recovery and the birth of the online Animal Art Masterclass. With over 100 pet and wildlife tutorials and in-depth courses on color and technique and even business, creatives can not only adopt a new creative habit, but also build skills and confidence needed to accept commissions or create paintings as gifts for friends and family for the holidays. The online Animal Art Masterclass is designed to help you master technique while reducing stress. But what if you've already built those skills in acrylic paint? Or what if you're very familiar with a specific medium like pastels or watercolor or oil paint, and you just wish you could finally find your artist style? Do you wish you could tell a story with your authentic, unique, original paintings? Well, I'm about to launch my new course and monthly challenge, Original Animal Artists. Here I teach creatives how to build original paintings that they develop from their own ideas and concepts in a basic sketchbook, following my 5-phase creativity system, a creative process paired with the very breakable rules and principles of art that help creatives with any medium surface a very distinct artist style. So if this would bless you or a friend, I have links to both of those courses down below. Now, if you join the waiting list for my new course, Original Animal Artists, those on the waiting list will get my early bird rates. Now, for these next steps, I recommend your background be dry or tacky. That takes about 5 to 10 minutes. Pause this tutorial if you need to, but then we'll pick up our size 1 liner brush again. And to paint the focal points, I'll use burnt umber and black. That's a mixture of burnt umber and black. I'm going to outline the eyes, fill in the pupils, and also we will be going back to that blue-violet mixture in the dog that we used in the background. I'm going to pull it back in as we're adding little highlights around these eyes. Now, I'll not outline that thick shadow yet. I'll just outline directly around the eye and the iris and the pupil. In fact, I'll be filling in that pupil. And if you notice here, I'll also be pulling down the left side of that line on the left side of this eye. I'm going to add a bit of thickness to the corner of the inside of this eye. And at any point, if you feel your brush is pulling on your canvas or it starts getting too thick where you're not getting those fine lines or dots, that's when you need to wash out your brush. You wash it out in your cup of water, you dab it damp on your paper towel or cloth, never sopping wet and never to the point of being dry. Getting down the feel of painting with acrylics and painting animals is just as important as technique. Now, still using our mixture of black and burnt umber, I'm going to fill in that pupil. Now, as a little tip to prevent your paints from drying, you could either use a spray bottle of water, tap water, or you can, in between painting sessions, cover your paint palette of all your paint colors with aluminum foil or saran wrap. I've noticed this will keep my paints wet for up to 3 days, maybe a bit longer, but that way you can spread this painting tutorial over a couple days while maintaining that wet, creamy consistency of your paint. If you'd like to see the glass paint palettes that I use, I have them linked in the description. Now watch me here before you give it a go. I'm going to outline that outer line below the eye, leaving a small little gap on the far left. I'm going to do something else with that with our blue violet from our background. Anytime you're working with some browns, whether that be dark or light with your animal portraits, add in some violet. It goes so well with brown. And so I'm going to mix some of that blue violet mixture just a smidge with the burnt umber. Now I'm going for a slightly lighter value than the black and burnt umber that we've just added to the eye. So I'm going to use this for the shadow on the top of the eye and for the gap in between those lines below the eye. Now I'm actually going to make this area lighter than any of the other shadows we've added to the eye with adding more of the blue violet to that brown. So it's going to have a lot less brown now, and I'll fill that in, especially on the far left side of that gap. Then while it's still on my brush, I'm going to add that to the inner corner, kind of spilling out into that fur area on the right side of the left eye. All right, you ready for the second eye? We're going to let that left eye dry for a bit. We're going to repeat many of the same things to that right eye. It's going to be much darker than the left eye. So we'll just work with that burnt umber and black mixture first with a clean damp brush. And let's talk about that light source, shall we? Where do you think that main light source is coming from? Well, when you're ever in doubt, try and get all the details from the reference photo, either from the client, the photographer, or do your very best as the artist to pull out as much information from that reference as you can, especially that light source. We might have one, we might have two, we might have more than that, but in this photo, the main one is in the upper left. We also have another one coming from behind Floyd. Now what I'm doing to this right eye is I'm going to work that outer line. Try your best to carefully curl that line up, not going into the nose, but almost, because of the angle of his face. We're only seeing kind of a little more than half of that eye. And because of how little light this eye is getting, I'm going to go in with just black and carefully, ever so carefully, painting the right side of that pupil, making sure it looks very consistent with that left eye. Now what I'm going to do with my burnt umber and black mixture is to soften that expression in this dog's face and to help me create that shadow inside the iris on this left eye. I'm just going to bring down the shadow over top some of that white. And be very careful that you don't lose proportions here on these tiny details of the eye. I sort of did right here on this right side of the right eye. But once I wash off my brush, making sure it's damp, I'm going to go into that violet and brown mixture, and I'm going to fill in the gap on this right eye between these two lines. I'll also add this to the top of the right eye. The difference here though, on this eye compared to the left, is I'm going to start creating these clusters of curving lines up and to the right, getting that shadow up a little higher because of how dark it is. Working along this first curved line that I'm working up, I'm going to go all the way up there and to the right. Now, still working with this brown and blue-violet mixture, I'll add a few dabs below the eye, very tiny, thin, short, stubby lines that are the beginnings of that fur texture. I'll also do the same above the top of the left eye. Now, still using this dark brown and blue-violet color, I'm going to bring the side of the far left side of the eye down. That line could come down further, and then pull the inside right of this left eye down as well. Bringing that all the way to the right where we have that line for that brown and orange marking that we'll be painting relatively soon. All right, so we're going to move on to the nose, take a little break from the eyes, and we're going to go back to our color of black and burnt umber. Now, Floyd's nose is the perfect example for a reddish brown nose. And so what we're going to do is use this black and burnt umber to just fill in the nostrils, then just outline the bottom of the nose, and then working in brown with pink. You could also go brown with red to start filling in the darks, the medium values, and the lights while it's all wet, using a combination of the wet and wet technique and some layering because of how large this nose is. Make sure you get in that curl on the ends of both nostrils, and then we'll move down to the bottom, outline that V and the indent in the center bottom of the nose. All right, so we're still going to use our size 1 Arteza liner brush to fill in this nose. We want it clean and damp. Then we're going to use fluorescent pink and raw sienna, and get this, violet. We're going to use violet. It's a great color, like I said at the beginning, to pair with brown. So right now I'm mixing fluorescent pink, raw sienna, a bit of white, and a tiny bit of violet. When in doubt, test it out. Just test your colors. If you like it, keep it. If you don't, paint over it. I'm just gonna try this color out on the lower left side of the nostril, of the nose below that left nostril. I kept running with it for a little while, but then I realized it wasn't quite dark enough. So then I pull in more violet, more raw sienna, and more fluorescent pink. And because this was quite a bit darker, I start working on that darker side, the right side of the nose. Because our light source is coming from the left, this right side of the nose is going to be very dark. These are the kind of reference photos I look for when creating my original paintings. When there's a really strong light source from one side and not all over lighting. This kind of lighting creates strong contrast where one side's quite dark, the other side's quite light. So then when it comes to these obtuse colors, I can more easily be creative and find these darks and lights. All right, so I'm going to move back over to that lower left side of the nose, blending that into that original color. And now we're going to hunt down all those areas that are shaded on the nose. So what I'm looking for only right now in my reference photo are all the areas that I see a dark reddish brown. So I see this on the inside rim, lower part of the nose, surrounding the nostrils, also the top right and the bottom right. All right, so now because we're moving to a lighter color that will blend into that one, I'm going to wash up my brush, make sure it's damp. Into a corner of this paint mixture, I'll pull in fluorescent pink, raw sienna, and white. That's fluorescent pink, raw sienna, and a bit of white. Just in case I have to go back to that darker color that we were just using, which is very likely, I want to leave it, a little pile of it, and I'm going to blend that lighter pinkish brown into those darker values, moving from right to left. I tested that color out. It's a little too brown, needs a bit more pink. So I pull in a bit of pink and blend that directly into my canvas. All right, little trick here. Anytime you're having trouble blending areas and you have quite a bit of paint that's still wet on your canvas, wash off your brush and use kind of like a little paint mover with a damp brush with nothing on it. So I'm going to wash off my brush, make sure it's clean and damp, and then I'm just going to blend that together with a damp brush. There's enough paint on here that I'm not pulling it off. If I had a very thin amount of paint, I would be basically erasing it. It would just stick to my brush. But then I go back to the darker color, the darker brownish red that we have a little side pile of, and I start working that on the lower part of the left nostril. Now with a few dabs, just a few, I work that up the upper left side of the nose. Then I go straight into the lighter version of brownish pink and I blend that down. I'm actually running out of this lighter paint mixture, so I'm going to mix up some more. That's fluorescent pink, raw sienna, and white. Anytime I do that, remix some of the same color, it's always going to be slightly different, but it adds so much interest to the painting. And so what I'll do is fill in the white on the left side of that nostril, and then start shaping this angle on the upper right of the nose. We have this pretty strong highlight. We'll need a bit lighter pinkish brown for that. But before I mix that up, I want to have a distinct difference between that highlight and this area. So I washed off my brush, went to the darker brownish pink, brought that shadow up a bit more on the top far right of the nose. Dab, 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 dab. That's all I'm doing. Just lots of dabs, blending, and filling in some of that white. Now I go a little too fast and I go straight to that original pinkish brown. But I say add in some white right here. This needs to be a bit lighter. So just pull in some white into this light pinkish brown and start working it over the top right. So if you look at the colors we've been using for the nose, we have our three values, our light value, our medium value, and our dark value. I'm going to go back to our medium value, pinkish brown, and start painting in the rest of the white we have on the nose. But as I move up towards that upper left part of the nostril, I'll pull in more of our dark value. This is how I simplify painting pet portraits. I just look for the dark, the medium, and the light value. Sometimes when I can't find that medium value, I just look at the lightest values and the dark. Could be any color in the rainbow. But as long as I know the light and the dark, I can mix those together to find that in-between medium value. Now we really want that far right side of the nose to be dark. So in a moment, I'm going to be pulling in more violet and raw sienna into our dark value here and adding that again, revisiting all the dark value areas surrounding the nostrils, on the lower part of the nose, and the upper and lower far right. Now you can see I'm still using our original darker value. I just work that for a little bit until I move to more violet and raw sienna. Now, just a reminder to keep a relatively steady pace so we can keep our colors damp. By now, we might have a few layers on our nose dry. So also making sure that you don't let your colors on your paint palette dry. If so, just mix them up. And it's okay if we don't have the exact same colors. Now this is how I want to help train you to see those really subtle highlights. Do you notice in a reference photo that very subtle highlight to the right of that line indent on the bottom of the nose? Now you can see I almost try to shape that with the colors I have, but then I realized I'll just paint over that, blend that into this color. So just fill in that lower part of the nose and work it to the right. Now I don't want to leave that dark brownish pink strip on the top of the nose, so I'm going to go back to our medium value and blend that in with some dabs, also creating that bumpy texture that we see on dog noses. This is why I'm not trying to smooth it out, but instead do tiny little dabs. And now here's where I'm going to wash off my brush and go to our light value so we can blend in that subtle highlight that I was talking about on the lower right side of that line indent. So if you need to mix up more of this lighter color, do that now, because we revisit the dark values and then we jump to our lightest values. And then we're just going to layer that over top with little dabs. Now we also have a bold highlight on the right side of the nose below that right nostril. So with our light value, pinkish brown here, I'm going to add that in. All right, so we're going to add highlights to all the left side areas getting hit by that light source. At this stage, you never want these highlights to be just straight white. We want to either have just pink in it or pink and brown to make it look more realistic. So to finish off this nose, for now, I'm going to mix up white and fluorescent pink to really pull out that strongest highlight on the top right of the nose. And before we move on to the mouth next, there's actually one last thing that I do. After I add this highlight, I go in with my darker version of violet, raw sienna, and pink, and I pull up that shadow just slightly on the top right of the nose. All right, so guess what? We'll be using very similar colors that we use for the nose for the inside of the mouth and tongue. The only addition is permanent red that we'll be using. So I'm going to mix up more fluorescent pink, violet, and raw sienna, and we'll start working inside the mouth in those darkest areas on the tongue. I want to draw this dark value up along the mouth and along that line indent on the tongue. Also painting the entire back area of the tongue, not the entire tongue, and then carefully outlining the outside of the tongue. All right, so we have our darkest value in the tongue. Let's find our medium value. This part will need permanent red. I'll add that in a moment to my paint palette, mixed with fluorescent pink, raw sienna, and white with a tiny bit of permanent red. I want to vary the reds and pinks here in this portrait, not having the tongue exactly like the nose. So I'm adding a little bit of permanent red, fluorescent pink, raw sienna, and white. Now, once you have your medium value mixed up, we're going to blend that into the dark value. Now, before I get to the very end, the outer edge of the tongue, I'm going to mix in some white into this color and then paint that in. Now I'm going to wash off my brush thoroughly so that I can revisit those two colors again, the dark, the medium, 3 colors, and the light value, to go over any little white specks I might have missed or to better blend those colors together. Now, are you starting to see that pet portraits aren't actually that scary? If you just focus on one body part at a time and then separate that into 3 different values, your dark, your medium, and your light, and using any color you want, it doesn't have to match the photo as long as it's the right value, the relative lightness of that color. Man, does that make this process fun and efficient. So all I'm doing right now is bringing out those dark values. If you missed it, I pulled in some permanent red with some more violet and raw sienna into this paint mixture to make it a bit darker, the dark value we used originally. And where we added that light pink bordering the inside of the tongue, inside of that, I pulled the shadow up from the inside of the mouth along that border on both sides. Going back to the medium value pinkish brown with my clean damp size 1 liner brush by Arteza, I'm going to now outline the teeth around them with this color. Another great function for this size 1 liner brush, it works so well at just getting the gum line around the teeth, getting up into those little crevices to a point, but also filling in some space, filling in the pink, those droopy gums and mouth with this brush. And by the way, if you're struggling to grasp contrast and color value, and you want to learn how to create a harmonious, balanced painting, color can be incredibly confusing, overwhelming, but I teach this in my creative color course in the online Animal Art Masterclass. It's here I show creatives how to choose, mix, layer, blend, and apply color for the semi-realistic style animal portraits. I'm going to work to the left of this big canine tooth using this color, but not covering the entire area down. I'll then add some white to this and some more fluorescent pink and start blending to the left. Now you see how I'm pulling that light pink into the end of that medium value while also filling in the white to the right? Well, I won't cover up the whole area to the right. I'll actually start moving to the left. I'm running out of this color. I'm going to mix up some more on my paint palette and start working on that droopy gum to the left, and we'll work around that marking. It's almost like this kitty ear marking the top of those ears. That's what comes to mind for me. And I'm going to work around them with this pink, bringing this color all the way up to the bottom of the top lip. Once again, I'm just mixing up some more. I'll always tell you before I mix up a different color. Now my dark value pinkish brown has dried, so I'll mix up some more with violet, fluorescent pink, and raw sienna. Again, that's a bit of violet, fluorescent pink, and raw sienna, working on the darker parts of the gums and even shadows, like right here. There's a bit of a shadow from these folded gums. And now I'll work on that marking. And once again, with these smaller focal points, these smaller areas, I want to work at a steady pace so I can blend that before it dries. I will be using this color, blending the dark into that light pink on this droopy gum. Now pay close attention to which line I'm filling in. It's this strip below that pink that we painted partially. Okay, I'll move that to the right, and before that pink dries, I'll blend in that shadow below the top lip. Now, as I move over to the right, I'm actually going to start pulling in more pink and violet because I see there's this subtle highlight on that far right side of this part of the mouth. So I'll fill in the rest of that white with a mixture of fluorescent pink, violet, and white into that previous dark value, blending it to the right. And again, that's violet, fluorescent pink, and white. Now we're not done with that violet and pink just yet. I'll actually add a bit of it to this strip on the left side where we're getting that light. All right, so I see a bit of darkness below the teeth area and on the top part of this gum strip that we just painted. So with the clean damp brush, I'm going to go in with a bit of burnt umber into that color, our dark value we were just using. And carefully, only will I add this to the front of the mouth, above the strip that we just painted, and below the teeth. Now this is where those colors really come in. I'm going to mix up more of our fluorescent pink, violet, and white. This is a medium to light value of fluorescent pink, violet, and white. And the rest of the white we have on those gums along the pink area, I'm going to fill this in. Now I'm going to pull this purple over a little bit, cutting up into the gums. This is going to be the beginning of a shadow we add, those droopy gums. I'm going to add more of those that cut up into the gums at the front with our mixture of burnt umber mixed with our pinkish violet. Because if you notice, it's a mixture of a bit of discoloration in the gums here and also not much light getting to it. Now, try to ignore the shapes that I'm making here because it looked a bit silly to me. So I decided then to blend it into that pinkish violet. All right, guys, we're almost done our focal points, but before I move back to the eyes, I'm going to get that highlight in to the far right of this area, this gum line, mixing up a light violet. So violet with some white, very abstract color here, but it's going to be just a tiny little dab we add to the side of the mouth. And to almost help connect the light pinks with the light violets and to get that light source that we're getting from the left, I'm going to add just little dabs here on the left side. Oh, and I can't help myself. I will continue with this color. I see a bit of a shadow in that pink area of this droopy side of the gum. So this violet is going to act as that shadow. All right, creatives, how we doing? Is it going okay? We gotta paint the irises on both eyes, and this will be really quick and easy. Not difficult here. Still going strong with our very functional size 1 Arteza liner brush. I'm going to mix up yellow ochre, raw sienna, and white. That's yellow ochre, raw sienna, and white. I'll fill in the iris, the colored part of the left eye first. Now do your best to stay inside that outline, but if you go over it, easy to fix. It's just black and burnt umber to touch up any of the areas that we went over that line. And then what we'll do while this is wet is we'll pull in burnt umber into it to fill in and blend in to the top of the iris. Do you remember my blending trick? Get that brush clean and damp, not sopping wet at all, because this is actually a very tiny area. Too much water will cause a mess up, and then just blend those two colors together. Now, this right eye is so much darker, so we're going to add in a lot of burnt umber into that original color. So I'll pull in more raw sienna and burnt umber into this yellow ochre brown mixture, fill in the entire iris, keeping it pretty dark. Just make sure the value is not darker than the pupil and the outline around the eye. If it is, add more raw sienna or even yellow ochre. Now, before we add our light gray eye highlights, I'm going to revisit my black and burnt umber to outline the eye, fill in the pupils, anything that I went over with our colors for the iris. Now, did you know you can also use a very light violet for eye highlights? Simply mix a tiny bit of violet with white, and I'm just going to do little dabs on this right eye. That highlight is more curved on the outer right, along with 2 tiny little dots over top the pupil on the bottom. Now on the left eye, this is very important. I'm not going to pull those highlights all the way to the top of the eye. I'm going to bring it down just a little bit from that eyebrow shadow. And that's because our light source is coming from the top left. Now these highlights are more horizontally placed. I'm going to place mine almost as if they're touching, but not quite. Now I just can't help myself. I'm going to touch up the right side of that right eye. You may not need to do that to yours, but by doing that, I noticed a subtle highlight that I also need to add in. I'm going to add in more violet into this violet and white mixture we just made. Add a little bit of that on the lower part of the right eye, along with a small dab extending out that highlight on the left lower part of the eye. Next, I'm going to mix up a light gray with white and a very small amount of black to fill in the white gaps surrounding that iris, and this is on the left eye. Now, in order to get this shadow inside here, you need to have a very clean, thin, fine brush. When the paint dries to it, it makes it thicker, which makes it harder to get into tiny areas like this. I'm going to add in a tiny bit of black so that I can get these shadows on the left and right sides of this area, this light gray area that we're filling in. We still want some of that light gray, but I'll blend that carefully into the bottom and top area. And I know for me, I went over that outline that we made around the eyes with our black and burnt umber. I'll just go back to that and touch that up. And I almost forgot about those teeth. Let's paint in those teeth. I'll mix up yellow ochre and white. I never recommend using just white for teeth. Even puppies don't have all white teeth. So with the clean damp brush and yellow ochre and white, we'll just fill those teeth in. And then while they're wet, we'll blend in some gray for the shadows. Now, if you're going to add detail to any part of your pet portrait, let it be the focal points. You can tell this was a lot of work. We've added tons of detail to the eyes, nose, and mouth, and we're even not done, but this is where the viewer looks first. So that's really where we want to spend majority of our time. Then we actually spend a little bit less time on the fur and the other parts. So the worst is behind you. The best is yet to come. Now, if you have a bit of light gray left on your paint palette, use that, or just add in a very small amount of black and white into this yellow ochre mixture. And we're just going to add shadows around the canine teeth on the top of the left one and the bottom inside of the right one. Next, we're going to work on the connected part of our portrait, and that is a collar. I'm going to make it a navy blue instead of boring old black, using phthalocyanin blue, black, and white. That's a deep dark navy blue using phthalocyanin blue, black, and white. And I'm going to switch to my size 2 Arteza Filbert brush. Piece of cake here. With this brush, we're just going to fill in the collar. Now, this is a smaller filbert brush, very useful for producing a variety of different marks and effects. The bristles lay flat, kind of like a flat brush, but with that rounded outer edge. This brush is ideal for painting leaves and flowers, applying base coats. I'm not so concerned about fur texture right now because we're going to be layering fur over top this. But when I'm painting thick, clumpy, curly, or long fur, this brush is great for that. Or just filling in small areas like this collar or even noses and tongues. I want this collar to be a bit more blue and less gray, so I'm going to pull in phthalocyan blue, put it directly on my canvas and blend it in. All right, this is my favorite part, the fur. And we're gonna mix up a bunch of colors so that when we're painting it, we can just focus on technique and our brush and not so much on color. Yes, we'll do some mixing along the way, but we'll have our core colors here on our paint palette. Now with my triangular palette knife, I'll talk about that more in a bit. I'm gonna mix up raw sienna and burnt umber. That's lots of raw sienna, a little bit of burnt umber for our dark value here. Over top a dried area. The paint below this is completely dry. Now definitely mix up a good amount of each color here. We have quite a bit of our brown fur to paint in. Now to clean off your palette knife, to not mix it into the next color, just wipe it off on a paper towel or cloth. I'll pick up lots of raw sienna and yellow ochre. That's lots of raw sienna and yellow ochre for our next color. Now I'm actually not going to wipe off my palette knife for the next color because I want this color, a little bit of it, into my orange, my favorite orange that I love to make, with yellow ochre and fluorescent pink. Yellow ochre and fluorescent pink, just a color that I always include in my animal portraits. We want to mix up a lot of this. I want to pull out the oranges I see in this light brown fur coat in Floyd. Now, do you notice I'm mixing from dark to medium to light? We're going to have several different dark and medium and light values, but this is what we'll pull from. That's what really gives fur dimension. I'll mix up yellow ochre, a bit of raw sienna, and lots of white. I'm using my Fluid Titanium White by Golden Brand, which is, this consistency is a bit difficult to pick up with my triangular palette knife. But that's the only difficult part when it comes to mixing with this tool. Not only can the palette knife help you to mix up more of a color, but it also can help extend the lifespan of your brushes. It's a very easy tool to use and to clean. And not only mixing, but this can be a great tool for adding that texture directly on your canvas or even paper. If you're using paper, I just recommend that heavy-duty mixed media paper. Now, my water, I don't know about yours, looks like a beautiful blue ocean. I want to clean that out, replace it with clean water so we can go straight into that orange and brown fur. I'm going to now grab my all-time favorite brush, okay, one of them for painting fur, and that's the Arteza Cat's Tongue brush. I'm going to grab color number 1 that we mixed, our dark value, and I'm going to paint that back ear below the chin. This is another brush that if I could only have a handful of brushes, I would absolutely include this one. It just is one of those underrated brushes, and I don't know why, but it has an unusual shape with a wide base, tapered to a very small tip. Another very versatile brush, great for doing detail work with that small little point, and also unique painting effects like fur texture, and filling in large areas like we're doing here. Just filling in an area with that wide base really helps. Now we'll continue on with the same color and the same brush, working those darkest areas first on the left ear. Lots of folds to paint in, and we're gonna start on that fold that's going up from the collar. I'll work up that line and work majority of that section of the ear, and then we'll move to our next color. Now before I work this brown on the other side of this flap, I'm going to pull on our second paint mixture that's a little bit lighter and blend it directly into this brown while filling in the rest of that white on this portion of that left ear. Now, how I'm using my cat's tongue brush to create the beginnings of this fur texture, even though this Basset Hound definitely has short fur, we can still see it from this view. I'm going to use that point at the center of this brush and just cluster lines into that dark brown. Now, these lines aren't perfectly refined. This is just layer one. We can begin to create that texture using lines that are about the same length and the same width. Now for this next portion of the ear, I'm going to do something a little interesting, okay? So I recommend you watch me and then you give it a try. I'm going to use that dark value brown again. I'm going to paint to the left and center of this portion of the ear, leaving a tiny little white border connected to that other part we just finished. Because of this being the same brown, I don't want it to just mesh in. I'm leaving kind of a guideline for myself so that I can blend in that lighter version of brown into this line so it can better separate these two parts of the ear. This is a great technique when you're painting floppy ears or folds, wrinkles. Now you can see I'm working on the bottom, doing the exact same thing on the right side with that border, and then I'll pull in that lighter brown, the same one we used on the previous part, to blend it up and along that line. Now, it doesn't actually end there with that border. I'm also leaving a border to the left of this portion. In that area, we'll use a much lighter color, actually our lightest color that we mixed up. After we've blended in this medium brown, I pulled it in just now, in the middle and to the right of this line. I'm going to wash up my brush thoroughly because we are going to be blending in a much lighter color. Make sure it's damp, not sopping wet, and not dry. I'm going to pick up our lightest color we mixed up for the fur and watch me here because I'm actually painting at an angle. No longer am I painting up and down, but a little bit angled to create that furry texture as I'm working down this part of the ear. Now before I move on to the next part, I'll still be using this color to add a bit more highlights to the first part of the ear we worked on. We don't need much on our brush. We're just blending it in to this lighter brown area on this part of the ear. So delicately, so lightly am I adding clusters of lines over this area. I'm barely applying any pressure. Now, as I step back and look at my Floyd painting, I'm realizing that that brown, the dark value, isn't quite dark enough between those two areas that we just painted on the ear. So I'll take our dark value brown, add some black to it, and then darken that shadow up that separates those two parts. Here we go, working on the next part to the left on the ear. I'm going to go on again with my brown, with my cat's tongue brush. Holding my brush at a very similar angle that I used when I was applying that highlight of yellow to the portion to the right of this. So I'm carefully cutting into that, maintaining that texture. I know this can be a bit tricky because we're trying to apply paint and cover up that white and cut up into that yellow. So just utilize that point of the brush and also the base, the wide base that helps us cover an area. Now, if you watch me, I'm working down now, leaving a strip of white again on the right side of the ear. If you notice in the reference photo, there is a small little highlight where the ear's folded, and that's where I'm gonna blend in to that area, this medium brown. But then continue on with that medium brown at the top, pulling it down using that angled movement with our brush. And do you notice those two lines to the left of this area we're painting? Well, I'm only going to pull this angled, these clusters of lines down over top the first line. Once again, blending a lighter highlight into that thick border, that thick white strip we're leaving. But before we do that, we need to have the darker area behind it painted. So I'm going to pick up our medium brown again, working up along that line now, and with my brush angled a little bit more to the left. And do you notice that line right above here that connects to the ear? I'll work this color using that technique all the way up to that line, all while ever so slightly cutting up into that border we're leaving, that white strip. That way we don't have any little white gaps that we have to fill in later. Just like I told you at the beginning of this tutorial, it's better to go over it just slightly so that we can layer fur texture over top so it creates that depth. It might be easier to pull that paint all the way up to that line and then carefully work down along that border. And just another reminder, while you still have this wet brown paint, we might as well paint in the sides. Now, just a heads up to let you know that we still need this area to be wet and damp so that we can blend in some darker brown. Now I'm going to wash off my brush because we're going to move to our dark brown again. I'm going to use that brown to not only paint the sides, but pull it up over the edge, working from this right corner of the ear up along the left side of that white strip that's still left on this ear. I'm not only going to use this brown to richen up that color there, just give it yet another layer of this brown, but also cut into that medium value brown to create more of that texture and the shadow being created from that fold. And it's this cutting in technique where we cut in with these clusters of lines using that little point on our cat's tongue brush where we're both adding more layers and it's doing a bit of blending because the bottom layer is a bit damp. This is what's really going to help transition from that dark value to the medium to the lighter one at the top of this ear. Now, before we move to our lighter values and our orange, which I can't wait to start adding, we're going to actually add a bit more of this medium value brown up a little bit more, a little bit higher on this ear. We didn't quite go up high enough. So what this means is we'll be working adjacent right next to that light yellow highlight, and I'll bring it all the way up to the head. And also pulling in just a little bit of that brown. Now, if all you can see are the flaws in this painting, the flaws in yourself, I have some encouragement for you. This brought me hope and encouragement through my own recovery. It's one I actually have hanging in my bedroom right by my bed. Psalms 139:14. You are fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. This I know full well. Now I'm back using my size 2 filbert brush. This part gets a little tricky, so take your time, okay? I'm gonna mix up some of the orange that we haven't touched yet and our light highlight value of the light yellow. I'm gonna create short little stubby brush strokes going along this white strip and positioning my brush again at an angle. We want it to cut into the right side, join nicely with that fur, but overlap with bumpiness and that fur texture on the left side of this line. I want to keep the top of this line lighter, so more yellow, and the bottom more orange. Just be aware too that we're moving our brush down along this white strip and it kind of comes to this fine point. So if you need to wash out your brush, make sure it's dry and just add a little bit of paint so you don't have thick brush strokes at the bottom. Now I'm thinking that we need more orange on that first highlight we made. I'm going to add a bit of this orange along the strip in the middle and then work up more yellow at the top of that highlight, hardly adding any pressure to my brush. I really want to keep a fine, thin highlight, just a little bit more orange at the bottom, a little bit more yellow at the top. And if you need to, revisit the other side. Do touch-ups to those oranges if they look a little scruffy. Now for this next step, if you feel more comfortable with a filbert brush like I'm using, or a cat's tongue brush, or any other brush, we just need a short, fine line. I'm using the flat edge of this filbert brush at an angle to create more of this texture with orange. That's the brownish orange we mixed up, and that's at the upper part of this part of the ear. Next, we're going to add a bit of orange to that back ear. Now that paint has dried, it's pretty much completely dry by now. So we're going to have to I'll add in some of that orange-brown mixture to the lower front of the ear, the back ear, and then I'll go straight into the dark brown that we used and blend that back into that ear. I repeat this a few times. I do a few rounds of this so that I can get that subtle orange hint of a highlight on that lower back ear. All right, so let's fill in the rest of that light orange brown, the spot on the left eye. I'm going to start with the medium brown. We've been going back and forth between that dark brown and this medium brown. I'm going to just start with the medium brown here using my small size 2 filbert brush by Arteza. I'm going to fill in majority of this spot and even down along the left side of the jaw. But I'll leave some areas white because I want to go in with our dark brown. So if you need to mix up more of that dark brown, this is definitely the time to do that. You might be running low. That darker brown was made using burnt umber and raw sienna. That's burnt umber and raw sienna. And in case you need more of this medium brown, we mixed up raw sienna and yellow ochre. Lots of raw sienna and a little bit less yellow ochre. Now this gap of white that I left to the right of the left eye is intentional. We're going to use our dark brown to fill that area in. And I know these lines on the left side of the face can be a bit confusing. Where that line goes down along the left side of that marking, that's where I'll be working to the left. We want to make sure that part to the right of that will use a light gray. Now where this comes to a point, this little nook I'll be pulling in that dark brown and blending it into that area for that shadow. Now let's begin to shape that face. I'm going to create a very thick, bold line at an angle below that left eye that kind of trails off to the right from the lower left side. Do you see this subtle highlight in the reference? I brought my brown up a little too high, so I go back with my medium brown and just pull that down a bit. But then I wash off my brush and fill in that area with our orange brown, just so we can get a bit more orange into that part of the face. I even add a few dabs of this brownish orange below that dark brown line. Now, both filling in the white and blending into that medium brown, I'll pick up the dark brown and fill in that area to the right of the left eye. Now I want to note the fur direction here. That's so important when painting fur. I'm using the flat edge of my filbert brush to pull my brush up and to the left slightly. Now I ran into a bit of trouble here, blending a thick, strong layer of dark brown into this medium brown. Something I mention in quite a few of my tutorials. If you haven't heard it, there's just a few colors, no matter what paint brand you buy, that are thin. We have to let this area dry instead of overworking it like I'm doing. That's my mistake. I should just leave this be, come back to it, and apply more dark brown, because I'm basically pulling off paint because of how thin this color is. It's like a handful of colors do this. Raw sienna, green, yellow, sometimes some pinks do this. Now I still do notice an issue with this with multiple different paint brands that I've used, but what can aid in this is getting heavy body paint in these colors. So anyway, there's just a quick little tip. I'm gonna work to the left now of this area, let that dry, and come back to that dark brown. Working with our medium brown again, you might wanna watch me here because this is another place where I leave thin borders, thin gaps. It helps me separate values and maintain proportions. So I'm mostly working on the left side of this part of the head, and then I'll join it to the medium brown on the side of the jaw. So I'm going to pick up my light yellow now and blend that from the top and along that strip of white, and even along the far left side too of the head. I'm keeping my mind open to those brush strokes, doing this pretty loosely. I'll even add a little bit of this highlight to the top, over top the medium brown above the left eye. those strips along the ear, those two strips that we added some orange and some of this yellow to, I'll add a bit more of this yellow to the top of both of them on the left ear. Now I'm going to add a mix of our darkest brown and the medium brown, and just add a few little dabs right above that left eye where it connects to the yellow. I'll do something similar, mixing two colors, but this time orange and our light yellow. I'll mix those two colors together and just add another highlight to the lower left of that left eye. And using the dry brush technique, what's left on my brush, not picking up any more of this color, I'll add this again below the left eye and along the jawline, and then even on the lower part of the inside of the left ear. And then using this lighter orange to add a little bit more highlight to the lower strip of highlight that we have on the left ear. All right, after all that, you'll definitely need to wash off that brush so that it's not getting sticky and clumpy and too thick. We're going to move on to the right eye, which is going to be definitely darker. We'll start with our dark brown. Now the fur direction is going in the opposite way now, kind of out and to the right, curving to the right. I'll add this brown up above, cutting into that dark gray, all the way up to that marking line and out. But now using my size 1 liner brush by Arteza, I'll pick up the medium brown, blend it into some of that dark brown, moving in that same direction, and also covering it more white. Now in a moment, I'm going to leave more white gaps, intentional white gaps that I leave for a different color. I'm going to work this brown a little bit more above the eye, doing what this brush is great for, those short, tiny little stubby brush strokes, and then also below the right eye, and then we'll use a different color to connect those two areas. See how I left that white strip? Well, we'll fill it in and blend it into that brown with our orange brown mixture and our light yellow. Now here's the thing about small brushes like this size 1 liner brush. It holds less paint. It has less bristles. You also don't want much paint on it, so you can do that fine line work. So that's just going to cause us to dip into more paint more often, but we need to wash our brushes more often with the detail brushes so that paint doesn't dry to it. Now this highlight on my brush will go so nicely on the left side, right above the left eye and below it, using fine lines with gaps in between. That's really important. Small fine lines with gaps in between for the highlight that goes at an angle below that left eye over top that orange brown. And because there's a light source coming from behind Floyd, I'm going to add this strong highlight on the top of the right eye. Over top some of that dark brown we added, we can lighten that up. All right, creatives, great work. We are very far along. I'm going to do something a little interesting. Work now below that nose on the far right side, and then work the gray into this area for the left side. Okay, so I'm going to start with my light yellow with my size 1 liner brush, and I'll just paint in that area on the right side, but then blend in the closer I get to that line indent with the orange brown. And then for a little bit more darkness, I'll add some brown to that area over top the brown orange, closest to that line. And next we're going to paint that white fur with a variety of different grays. I'm going to pull out my palette knife to mix up our first gray, which is more of a medium gray. So just a little bit of black, lots of white. We'll need quite a bit of this. And then the second gray, I'll pull from this one and add even more white to it to be our very light gray. Now black goes very far. It is going to be so dark even just with a small amount. So you really just want to add a tiny bit for this medium to light gray that we're adding. If you added too much black, either add more white to it or start a separate pile. Now for this part, I'll use my size 5 Arteza angle brush. We use the size 10 large angle brush at the beginning, great for painting in the background. Large areas of white while also getting in around nooks and crannies. I'm going to start with our darker gray, even though it's not actually very dark. It's a medium to light gray, working below this line on the neck. See how now I'm positioning my brush horizontally to fill in the white, and then here vertically with that point at the top so that I can create that fur texture, which is short and straight over top that navy blue collar. And to get that proper direction of the fur, which kind of goes out slightly to the left on the left side and out slightly to the right, cutting into some of that background on the right side, I'm going to twist my brush, turn that point so that I can create the right direction. And now another great use, filling in tiny little corners. I'll actually add more black to this medium gray. I'll blend that into this medium gray, but with the point of the brush facing up and getting into that tiny little area between this line and the ear. And we'll not stop there with this dark gray. There's a little pocket below the mouth that is actually like the same width of this brush. So barely moving it, I'm just pulling it down. But before I pull it all the way down, I'm going to pull in more of our medium to light gray, blend that in. Now this is just more droopy, floppy skin here. I'm not going to turn my brush to create that fur texture. And what I do here is a little bit fast. It's also a bit complex. What I'm going to do is turn my brush vertically and create this tiny little triangular gap, and then turn my brush horizontally and create a line above that. And then without picking up any paint, with my brush positioned horizontally, carefully working in and around that set of curved lines that moves all the way to those pink gums. Then with our lightest gray, I'll pick that up, blend that into the area we just painted, and again, leaving intentional white gaps. I'll start working down along this white strip with this gray, even down into the darker gray in that lower right corner. Then with our medium gray, I'll cut into that little corner. But before I bring it down, I'll pick up some of our light gray, add a few dabs of that to join into that lighter gray, and then bring it down to the next section of gray below this. Primarily in the middle of this strip, I want to lighten it and connect it to the strip above it. All right, and very simply, I'll pick up more of that light gray and fill in the rest of the white on that part of the neck. And don't forget, there's that tiny little triangular highlight. I left that out, but we do want to paint that in with this gray. Now I know that was a lot, so I'm going to give you a moment to catch up if you need it. Now I'm going to work the medium gray into the white strip below the navy blue collar now. Very simply just paint that in. I'll then wash off my brush, make sure it's clean and damp, and I'll move to the light gray. And if you watch me, how I create this fur texture over top this damp medium gray is I'll position my brush vertically with that point up, carefully clustering lines with small gaps in between as I'm also painting over that edge. It's a little tricky, so take your time. And because it's blending into that darker gray below it, we'll have to add a few layers. We'll have to reapply more of this light gray so it stands out. We have our base layer done. Now let's add even more of our fur texture with our size 1 Arteza liner brush. Now I am going to use just white. My base layer is still damp, and that's actually what you want so that it slightly darkens that white just a little bit, but we can highlight this area. And I'm not trying to cover up the base layer, but instead place lines very closely together. And as I work from top down, I'm going to stay within that middle range over top a lot of the medium gray layer that we added below. And you see how we have almost like 3 sections here of fur. Well, on each section, I'm going to bring lines down that cut out over top the end of it that creates that fur texture. Now be careful as you're working out a little closer to the shaded areas that you don't go in with straight white. I'm starting more in the center, then moving in towards those areas because it blends with that darker gray. If you need to pick up some of your darker gray so that there's this gradual variation from light to medium to dark while you're still creating that fur texture. And move your brush according to the fur direction. So on the right side, that fur's kind of moving out and curving up to the right above the collar. And then on the left side, that fur is doing the opposite thing, moving down and curving up a little to the left. Now I'm going to switch my brush direction, more horizontal, and curve it in this tiny area here below the gum line. We want that to be highlighted a bit more. And remember, in the area below this, we don't want to use straight white. We want to go in with our medium gray because this is a darker area. Always ask yourself, where is that light source? Where are the shadows? And how can I separate this section into 3 parts? Dark, medium, and light. That makes things so much easier, and you don't have to follow it exactly to the reference photo. And oftentimes when the values look so close, like you can hardly tell which one's dark, which one's medium, and which one's light, exaggerating those values a little bit will make our painting look a little less realistic, but in my taste, more interesting, more fun to paint, more expressive and loose, and overall a very authentic, freeing way of painting pets. Now I'm going to work white over top the previous fur texture that we added with our angle brush, along with a pretty bold highlight on the far right of this part of the chest. All right, you ready to work on the gray areas on the face? We're going to do the same thing, working wet into wet. I'll start with a medium to light gray mixed with our medium gray and a bit of the light, blocking in our dark values, which again, this is white fur. They're not actually dark, they're more medium in value. So I'm looking for any areas where there's a mild shadow from folds, wrinkles, indents, continuing shadows that we've already applied, like right here in between both eyes. Another area that I'm clustering lines at an angle. Now, if you watch me here, I'm going to actually block in this little white area. It's like a little wrinkle going along that line. Now bear with me, I'm looking for very subtle changes in the fur where I can add this slightly dark gray to the face. We have so much white on the face, but we can't just fill it all with white. That doesn't give it much dimension. But just remember, this is the base layer. We're going to be blending in and cutting in a lighter gray over top this, and any areas that we might have added too much or even too little, we can paint over it and go back in with this gray. All right, so here I go. I'm going to switch to the very light gray we mixed up, and now I'll start blending it in with this detail brush to the other very subtle shadows. But note, I'll be going back to that medium gray again in any areas I missed, like on the bridge of the nose, we have a few shadows that we're going to add. But before this dries, that's why I want to start blending our light gray in now. And that's why I haven't switched brushes for such a relatively large area, is because these are small little lines. That's why I want to be able to blend it, have more control with this detail brush. Going back to my medium gray, using more curved horizontal brush strokes, I'm going to cluster lines that start out wide and then get thinner as I work up the bridge of the nose, starting from behind the back of the nose. Now, I've heard artists say this before to me when they've watched my tutorials in sections where there's a lot of white. I find that the white that I'm using, the Fluid Titanium White by the Golden brand, again, the only white I buy, it allows me to not have to keep going back to my paint, filling up my brush, and also the paint doesn't dry so quickly to it because it's so watered down. And the consistency is just perfect for blending, for covering large areas, and working these small little areas with my detail brush for this long. And this is the reason why I get this paint. I add a lot of white to my artwork, and I'm not slowed down by the white just gluing to my brush, affecting my detail work, me having to wash up my brush and reapply it. This is why I love this white paint. So if you're finding that it's difficult to blend for you and with this brush, this is probably why. All right, so you can see that the fur direction is more up and to the left on the left side of the face and more up and to the right on the right side of the face. That's really important that as we're applying these lines, that we get the right direction. Just another reminder of that fur direction. It's so important. Now going in with my lighter gray to fill in that triangular gap of white located between the eyes. Now the horizontal brush strokes that are wrapped around the back of the nose, that area is still wet. So I'm going to actually try and pull some of that gray up so that it's slightly darker in value, pulling up to that line here. If you need to, just pull in more of the medium gray. I'm also not pulling that medium gray all the way to the right of the bridge of the nose. You can see I left a strip of white, again on purpose. I'll be using a much lighter gray for that. And I'm going to go over some of that medium gray that we put right here. I'm going to blend in some lighter gray into that and pull it down along the left side of the snout, below the nose. That area is going to be much lighter. Also, just a reminder, and maybe this is new information for you, but acrylic paint dries darker than how we see it when it's wet. So you might think it's a little too dark, but then it dries and it's just right. And so that's why I'm going in with just a slightly lighter value here in this little pocket.
Too soon. Autumn comes too soon. The light that flickers will blow away the sight.
Those little bumps on the lower left of this muzzle here, I'm going to use white to fill that in. And to add a bit more playful droopiness, because I love that so much about this breed, I'm going to add in, with my medium gray, just a slightest fold to the right of that bump we just painted in. Next, with a little bit of our light gray mixed with white, I'll use this to paint that little bit of Floyd's back that we see to the left of his left ear. Now that upper left side above the left eye, that part of the head is getting so much light. So I'm going to actually use just white, blending that up. But you'll notice that I'm intentionally cutting over top that background with the point of this brush to create that bumpy, furry texture, while also carefully bringing those clusters of lines in to connect and join with that medium value gray. Now this little nook needs to be just slightly darker. I'm going to go in with a medium gray here, so it kind of connects with that shadow of brown. But all the way above that, that strip of white that I left, I will paint in with just white. Now what I'll do, I like to do this at the end, to create really strong contrast, is going with just white, fill in the areas that are getting the strongest highlights, pulling those out even more, while also adding that fur texture. And again, this breed has short fur. These lines don't have to be very long, they shouldn't. So keep those lines short, but also make sure you don't have too much paint on the end of your brush. I'm almost getting there, because that's going to cause those points to be very thick, and you want them to be thin and fine. And because we have the majority of our base layer done for this area, except for that white bit beneath the nose that we'll use a brown on, this will require dabs and small short lines. And I'm getting kind of loose here, not trying to make things absolutely identical to the reference photo. With white still on my brush, I'm going to pull more clusters of lines with a bit wider gaps in between them so they really stand out, but being very careful with each line, pulling them down over top the navy blue collar and that portion of fur above it. And connected to this area above it, I'm just going to add a few more dabs of light gray right here. Now we're going to fill in the last part of white that we have left on our canvas. That's going to be with our light yellow. If you don't have any left, that's just white and yellow ochre. And I'll mix that with some raw sienna. I know I'm using from that medium brown, but just with a little bit of raw sienna, the yellow ochre and white, that'll do ya. And I'm going to start on the left side of that area, pulling it over to the right. And as I move to the right, I'm going to add in some more brown. So here is where I'm going to pull in raw sienna, start moving to the right, but not all the way to the right because we'll actually add a highlight there. I'll switch back to my liner brush, size 0, add some yellow ochre and white, that mixture, to the last part of white that we have to the right of this chin. I'll also add just a slight bit of yellow ochre and white mixture to the far left side, blending that into that tiny little corner. Next, we're going to get out that filbert brush, but the larger one. This is our size 7 Arteza filbert brush. And you'll see that I mix up 2 colors here, but I'm actually going to tell you to add another. So our top 3 colors we want to use for the leftover white below the nose. That's our brownish orange, the yellow ochre and white mixture, and our medium brown. I'm going to carefully paint that underneath the left nostril. I won't take it out all the way because then we're going to start making markings, little dots. Where this color joins with the light brown is going to be bumpy. It's not going to be straight, and it's going to end right above that canine tooth. And then I'm going to pull in some of our dark brown and blend that in closer to that indent, which for that I moved to the other filbert brush, the size 2. I want to make sure around that indent is darker, and that's on both sides. All right, now the width of this filbert brush is absolutely perfect for the size of these markings. I'm going to go back to our original color that we used for that left side below the nose, which is the brownish orange, the light yellow, and that medium brown. And this is the really fun part. We're going to see how nicely this comes together by just adding these little markings. You can see I paused here for a bit from the dots to just create a very thin line with my filbert brush along the left side of the nose, but then back to my dots, which are going to be scattered sporadically. Some are going to be positioned closer together than others. Some are going to be smaller than others. And if you want, you can use a spot brush. I find that the width and size of this filbert brush works for me. It works with this painting. But if you want to use a spot brush, which is a short, stubby detail brush, great for making dots and spots. But for me, I'm always thinking of what I'm painting and is the bristle size adequate for what I'm painting? Like, is it wide enough? Is it short enough? Is it long enough? So along with its brush use, These are the questions I also ask myself. I even see a little bit of this brown next to the gums here. So now that we have our base layer and the markings over top, my goal now is to join that gray with the brownish orange, using a bit of that brownish orange color with some gray. That's our medium gray with our light gray, or just mix up your own gray if those have dried for you. I'm going to cut into those areas, not only to connect them, but also to create that texture using my filbert brush. All right, so we're going to let that dry, and then later we'll add some more fine lines to add more texture over that. I'm going to move to my size 1 Arteza spot brush, and I'm going to mix up a light yellow. We're going to add lots more highlights in yellow, pulling out those yellows to complement the violets. So that's yellow, ochre, and white. My paints are starting to get really dry. You might be experiencing that too, but you don't want those globs of paint in your paint mixtures. So again, that's white and yellow ochre. And if you notice, I'm going to go all around this portrait, finding areas where it's between a medium to light value, where we've already painted, and I'm going to do clusters of short lines and dabs, sometimes like dots, and in all those areas getting touched by the light source from the upper left and even behind this dog. That's where I'll add this, because we want to make sure every part of this animal is consistent with where those light sources are. So I'm really not filling in at all. I'm just doing little tiny dabs, dots, and clusters of lines. So for this area, I just need it to be a bit darker in value. I'm going to mix in our brownish orange with a bit more yellow ochre. And here, because that highlight has disappeared on me, I'm going to apply more color to it again with some added raw sienna to this mixture and just bring that out again. Again, it dries darker than what we're seeing when it's wet. Now I'm going to go back to our dark brown mixture and our medium brown. And this was a tricky part for me, but I figured it out. We want to darken up the center part around the lips along that indent. But where that back lip curls, it's also a bit highlighted. Well, I want to use this brown to darken up that area all the way where it's even going into the mouth and on the left side of the lips too. So I don't want to leave any highlights around the center part of the lips. All right, so we went around with our light yellow as a highlight and then our dark brown as a low light. Now we're going to go to a violet highlight that we're going to be adding to certain areas. That's violet with white, a light violet. I'm going to add it to the right side of the mouth over top those purple gums. Just a small little hint of a highlight. I even pulled it out to kind of some dabs as it moves in. And then, surprisingly, we'll add this to the nose. There's 3 highlighted areas on the nose. These are areas we've already added a light pink to, but with tiny little dots with my spot brush, I'm going to add this highlight over top that to help make this nose look a little damp, very bumpy, and don't overdo it. Less is more here. You really don't need that much. All right, so now I want to talk about brush maintenance. So as I walk you through these next steps for the nose, I'm also in between going to talk about how you can take care of your brushes so they last a really long time. And I really mean it, guys. I am still using my Arteza brushes, the Variety Pack and the Detail Brush Pack, since 2021 for all my tutorials, all my custom pet portraits, and all my original paintings. Right here, I'm mixing up a magenta with a bit of brown. I want to pull out those magentas in the nose with a little bit of violet, lots of fluorescent pink, raw sienna, and white. Now, I always like to say, when in doubt, test it out. Just see if it's the right value. It's not too light, not too dark. We're painting over a medium value area right here. So just adjust it by making it lighter by adding in more white, or make it darker by adding in more violet. Now, as you can see, I'm working on the front center of the nose, but I'll also bring this out a little bit towards the outer edge to touch up any of the areas that I cut in a little bit with the gray. Now, one thing you never do with your detail brushes are leave them upside down, sitting in your water while you're painting. I will always wash them off as thoroughly as I can in the paint water and then leave them to the side. My larger, thicker brushes, I'll do that, but not with my detail brushes. This will ruin the thin bristles, the fine bristles, and also cause them to bend so they're not as straight, making it difficult the next paint session to create detail. Now, I've just added a lot of white to this paint mixture to add a more bright strip of highlight on the top of the nose. See how I'm blending that into the medium value we were just recently working with? And to add contrast and more violet, I'm going to remix our dark value for this nose. I want this more violet this time, so I'll add a decent amount of violet, fluorescent pink, and raw sienna. That's fluorescent pink, violet, and raw sienna. And with small little dabs and brush strokes, all the areas where we're getting the least amount of light, those darkest areas, I'm going to reapply this color. Now, another tip for maintaining your brushes for years to come is using Dawn soap, washing them off in warm water immediately after your paint session. I also recommend using designated varnish brushes that are only to be used for varnishing. There's actual wide base varnishing brushes that are extremely smooth bristles, but if you use your regular paint brushes to varnish, no matter how many times you wash them out with Dawn soap, they will stay really hard and sticky. Now, when I did that, I noticed there's this missing highlight, this area of white that I need to bring down on the top of the nose. I pulled my liner brush with some white and just quickly pulled that all the way down to the side of the right side of the nose. Now, something else that can help maintain your brushes is by making sure you replace your dirty water. If we're leaving those larger brushes upside down in the water while we paint and use other brushes, it's really helpful if that water is relatively clean. So I'll do that 2-3 times throughout a painting session. Now I'm going to mix up more of this color with more violet. I want to make this even darker because the area, that line indent in the bottom of the nose, there's some real dark values around there. So to the left of that line, I'll add this color, and without going over that highlight, I'll add it to the right side. Now, any way I can squeeze in more pink, I'm all for it, and I'm going to do that into the nose. I'm going to make a pinkish violet. It's more pink than violet here, with white, fluorescent pink, a little bit of violet, and raw sienna. So what this color is going to help us do is better connect our extreme darks with our very lights on the nose. We don't want big jumps. We want to have that dark to medium to light. Now, at the end, I also like to see how I can use some of those colors to fill in other areas with similar value. And there's areas around the gums to the left of that canine tooth that this dark brownish magenta will work great with. And that's the more violet mixture that we mixed up a little while ago. Over top this tiny little area that we added violet to, I'll add more darkness there. Almost like more kind of wrinkles, droopiness. And I see some things a little funky here. I didn't connect that shadow far enough to the left, so that's what I use this color for. All right, so now I'm looking for anything that doesn't look quite right. Anything that just needs subtle little changes to help make this look more finished. And right here on the back lip, I mixed up yellow ochre and white to create the smallest little highlight that pulls down, but not all the way into the mouth. I also see a kneaded shadow around the gums with the brownish magenta we were just using. Right where we applied the violet, that's not quite dark enough, so I'm going to use this instead. Now that white fur behind the left ear on Floyd's back is dried a little bit darker. I'm going to make it actually much, much lighter using just white. We want to fill that area in and pull it down along the sides. And then we're going to go around just like we did with our light yellow. I'm going to go around and see where those strongest highlights need to be drawn out even more, where I can add more fur texture, more detail, and that's using just white, and we'll do that before we add the little peach hairs and whiskers. That'll come after this. So take your time, step back from your painting, look at what your painting needs, which at this point will likely be different than mine, but we're always thinking of where that upper left side light source is hitting and coming from behind Floyd too. Now here's a unique highlight we haven't added yet, and that's at an angle moving in towards that right eye, but really short fur strands. So leave gaps in between and ever so carefully make those lines. Now it's time to do those tiny little hairs, the peach hairs and the whiskers. With my detail brush, I'm just gonna mix up a little small amount of white and our light gray so that I can pick up a very small amount of paint with my size 0 liner brush. This is size 0 liner brush, and if you watch me, I'm gonna start around the muzzle, doing these tiny, tiny little hairs that are very short, with large gaps in between and clusters over top the purple part and cutting into that light brown on the chin, and then repeating that same technique on below the nose on the top of the muzzle. And I want more clusters here, clusters of short gray lines that cut in over top that medium gray and the brown. Now it's very easy for this brush to get real thick because of the paint drying to it and just so few bristles. I'll be adding 2 little strands above the nose, and we really need a thin, damp brush for that here. Then I'll move to that chin again, working some long ones that cut into that blue background and over top the back ear. Now it's always a little tricky to work over the edge of a canvas, but I find it's really helpful to start over top the edge and then pull it down to the dog. And now for those whiskers. At any point, if you might mess up your whiskers, maybe make them a little squiggly, maybe a little too thick in some areas, we can just mix up our blue-violet background and carefully cut in over top the whiskers to touch it up. Using dabs instead of lines here, I'm just going to add little dots next to the root of these whiskers over top the light brown to pull out that highlight just a little bit more. Now I just love to find little ways to accessorize with color at the end. Of course, I'm going in with my pink, fluorescent pink and white to pull out those pink highlights along the gum line. And these ones will cut over top some of the purple part of the gum also. I'll use this pink on the nose. Those strongest little dots of highlights I'll add, and I'll richen up that highlight on the top right of the nose too. Now I'm not done yet with this pink because to show that this tongue is wet, working almost to the edge of that tongue, but not quite, I'll add little dots of light pink. All right, creatives, we are in the grand finale phase. We are nearly finished. We just have some final touches to add, and that's just revisiting what we've already done, just adding more layers, richening up our darks, richening up our lights, and I'll do that mixing black with burnt umber to add a shadow between the gum line and this chin, to touch up the darkness in the nostrils, add a bit more darkness between those ear folds, just going back to some of these areas again, making those darks pretty dark and the lights also very light. Now with very little paint on my brush so it doesn't overpower the dark pink or the light pink, I'm just adding this inside the deepest part of the mouth and carefully pulling that dark brown along the tongue indent. I'm adding a bit more of a curve to that left lip. This takes me a few tries to get just right. I kind of fixate on this part of the mouth. And then I also add some more darkness on that back ear where it kind of connects with that gum area. Ever so slightly, I'm going to use this dark brown to pull that shadow and line down to the left of the left eye. Now using extremely small dabs here on the nose, I'm going to pull out those dark values even more on the upper left of the nose and the lower right. We have to make sure that we're not going over any of the pink here, only adding darkness to the areas that we've already applied darkness. And last but not least, I'm going to go to our light gray. You might want to mix them up if yours is dry, just the smallest amount of black. I want to go over some of that medium gray to the left of the nose, almost on the bridge of the nose, but not quite, using lines to cut in to that so that I can kind of make that lighter and without going over any of the light brown dots. You know what? We can actually use this light gray to add the smallest highlight on the outer right of that far right canine tooth and just the bottom left of the other one. All right, creative, so there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and got a lot out of it. I'd love to see your rendition of Floyd. We have a YouTube community group linked down below if you'd like to share it and inspire others. Thanks for watching, guys. Have a great day. Bye.